Yeah, it's the start of a new week, well, at least a new work week in most parts of the world. And today's reading is, well, I'll just read it for you and then you can just let me know what you think. It's called Embracing Possibilities of Liberation. I had crossed the line. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and that was Teresa Taylor Stinson, Walking the Way of Harriet Tubman, public mystic and freedom fighter. And Ernest Holmes says, without harm, without hurt, we may liberate ourselves and help liberate others, lifting ourselves by the power of our creative imagination to the consciousness of the omnipotence of good and the omnipresence of the living spirit. And that was Creative Living, page 86, paragraph 3. So we have the choice, he's saying, in the divine mind to liberate ourselves. And this is a little bit different here from our wonderful writer this month, who I told you I've met him on Zoom, actually. I didn't actually meet him in person. I met him on Zoom when we had our events called Soul Session. And I was really impressed with the Raymont. I think he's like Ernest Holmes. He sounds different when you hear him than when you're reading him. So anyway, here we are. While attending Carlow University in the early 1990s, I took the first of many philosophy courses. The professor sparked numerous conversations, discussions, and debates about the writings of Paulo Freire regarding the concept of oppressor and oppressed. He says, we explore what it means to be either, how one becomes one or the other, and what makes someone no longer either. He says, if that is even possible. One quote from Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, pedagogy is education, that stuck with me is, the oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adapted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. And then he goes on to say, Carlow began as a women's Catholic university. He says, when I attended, there were only 3 men enrolled as students. And of the 3, I was the only African American. The professor, he says, often singled me out as the only black man, asking how I had experienced oppression. He says, as a man, how have I been an oppressor? Is there a place where those 2 identities clash with me? He says, I considered dropping the class because I didn't like being singled out. I don't think I would have either. He says, I'm thankful now that I didn't, because the discussions and the revelations that arose stayed with me and continue to unfold even today. And then he says, what does it mean to be liberated, emancipated, or set free? He says, what are we being freed from? And what are we freed to do because of this liberation? He says, are there ways in which we have taken on the tools of the oppressor's theology, dogma, systems, and structures, and how do we collectively address that? I don't think I've ever really been enslaved, to put it bluntly. I don't think I've ever been what I would call oppressed. Have I been prejudiced against? Yes. Yeah, quite a bit actually, when I was a kid, but I've never been oppressed as such, or at least I didn't regard it as oppression. I just regard it as discrimination and prejudice and bias. I grew up Catholic in the northwest of England. I grew up essentially in an Irish community. And although my ancestry technically is English, although we have no Anglo-Saxon blood in us, we were discriminated against because we were Catholic. Catholics were like 10% of the population. And even in my own family, which is 50% Catholic, 50% Protestant, I was on the Catholic side, there was lots of prejudice and discrimination. But I've never been oppressed as such. I didn't regard it as oppression anyway. And obviously, as a white male, I don't know what it's like to have suffered color prejudice. My wife does. Well, my wife doesn't remember, but her parents definitely were subject to that when they moved back from Indonesia to Holland, and because they were biracial, they weren't welcome in Indonesia or Holland. So they certainly suffered that. Were they oppressed? I guess they were. But personally, I've never suffered it, so I can't really speak from that point. My only way of speaking from it is, as I said, the discrimination I felt when I was a kid as a Catholic, and it was a big deal, you know. But as far as racial discrimination, no. As far as gender discrimination, no. I've never actually experienced that, so I can't really speak beyond it. But what I can say is, I can look to see where I might have missed people being oppressed. And when I find it, I can try and do something about it. And right now, in our political climate, I see lots of this creeping back. And I don't like it, and I can vote against it. But, you know, at Creative Life Spiritual Center, we don't get political, but we do support people who are oppressed, and we do support people who are underprivileged. So where do you draw the line? I don't really know, but at least when I read something like this, it opens my eyes and it makes me say, I need to look around and see, and if somebody is being mistreated in any way, shape, or form,